Have you ever watched someone get humiliated in plain sight, only to realize moments later they held more power than anyone in the room? What if the quietest passenger on a flight turned out to be the one who changed everything? This isn't just a story about an airline mistake. It's about what happens when dignity takes flight. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The Skyport Atlantic terminal buzzed with the low hum of evening travelers, rolling suitcases, and the occasional overhead announcement echoing across the wide glass halls. Outside, the Georgia sky was slipping into dusk, streaked with lavender and soft orange. The air inside smelled like polished marble floors, coffee, and something faintly metallic, like recycled air trying too hard to feel clean. Dr. Amara Ellison adjusted the strap on her small medical tote and stepped into the first-class check-in line. Her back ached. 7 months along, and her body felt like it was carrying two worlds, one inside her and one on her shoulders. The flight from Nairobi had already stretched her thin. All she wanted now was to get home, to her own bed in New York, to her husband's steady voice and a warm bath that didn't require coins. She wore a simple olive maternity dress, flats that had once been supportive but were now giving up, and a loose cardigan that had seen better days. There was no makeup on her face, no jewelry, just tired eyes and skin a few shades paler from exhaustion. She didn't look like someone who belonged in the first-class line, apparently. The airline attendant behind the counter looked up and then quickly looked down again. "Ma'am, this is priority check-in for Aurelia Sky's first class." Amara nodded politely and slid her ticket across the counter. "I know. That's me." There was a pause. The woman glanced at the boarding pass, then at Amara again, then called someone through a small radio clipped to her blazer. "I'm just double-checking your ticket," she said without smiling. Amara didn't argue. She'd seen this kind of doubt before. It never called itself what it was. It wore the face of policy or standard procedure. It said, "Just a moment, just a check, just making sure." But it always felt the same. She eventually passed through and made her way toward gate C-17. The boarding process had already begun when she arrived. Her group, first class, was now being called. She stepped forward, and then the stairs began. Inside the plane, first class was already alive with quiet murmurs and the subtle clink of crystal. Low lighting cast a golden hue across leather seats and walnut finishings. A man in a navy suit sipped red wine and scrolled through emails. A woman dabbed perfume on her wrist. A flight attendant handed out warm towels with a smile that barely touched her eyes. Amara stepped into the aisle and felt it, eyes glancing, then glancing away. A heavy silence around her like fog. She reached up to stow her carry-on, a small, worn leather tote with a stitched red cross on one side. As she struggled to push it into the overhead bin, her fingers slipped. The bag shifted awkwardly. No one moved to help. That's when she saw her. Claudette Wynne. Older, tall, perfectly pressed. A tight bun that didn't move even when she did. Her name tag sat straight above a spotless blouse. There was something machine-like in the way she walked. Measured, efficient, stripped of softness. Claudette approached, expression unreadable. Her voice was cool and clipped. "Ma'am, please don't block the aisle. This is first class. Someone will assist you." Eventually, there was no smile, no welcome. Just enough tone to let Amara know she was already an inconvenience. "I'm fine," Amara said quietly, managing to slide the bag in place. "Thanks." Claudette didn't acknowledge the response. She walked past without another word. Amara settled into seat 2A, breath shallow, hand on her belly as she adjusted the seat belt beneath the curve of her stomach. Her body ached. But more than that, it stung. Not just from the flight or the fatigue, but from something else. Something older. A kind of ache that had nothing to do with being pregnant and everything to do with being seen, and yet never really seen. The man across the aisle shifted in his seat and cleared his throat. Another passenger pulled their blanket tighter. The air felt colder. Amira closed her eyes for a moment, breathed in, then exhaled slowly, remembering what Tay always told her whenever she felt invisible. "They may not see you, but you're still here, and that matters." She opened her eyes again just as Claudette reappeared. The flight attendant paused at her row, scanning her with a look that started at the flats on her feet and ended at the frizz gathering near her hairline. Then she said, low enough for only Amara to hear, "Try not to disturb the others, all right?" Amara didn't reply. Her jaw tightened. Her hand rested once again on the curve of her belly. No, she wasn't alone. She never really had been. Amara sat back in her seat, trying to find a position that didn't make her lower back feel like it was on fire. The soft leather of the first-class seat looked luxurious in ads, but nothing about it eased the pressure building in her body. She adjusted the seatbelt once more, gently pulling the strap beneath her belly, then rested both hands over it like a shield. Her left shoulder still carried the sting. Not a bruise, not an injury exactly, but the weight of being dismissed so casually by someone paid to care. It was the kind of pain that didn't show up on a scan, but stayed with you longer than it had any right to. She glanced out the small window, not seeing much beyond the blurry silhouettes of ground crew moving in the growing dusk. But even that was better than catching another glance from the man across the aisle. He hadn't said a word, but the way he shifted when she sat down, the way his eyes narrowed for a second too long, it was familiar. Too familiar. Her phone buzzed. She reached into her tote, slid it out, and tapped the screen. "Let me know when you're seated. Drink some water. I'm waiting on the other end." She stared at the message for a few moments, her thumb hovering above the keyboard. No reply. Not yet. Instead, she locked the phone and placed it gently in her lap. The thought of Tay softened her shoulders. She could almost hear his voice, calm, steady, always laced with warmth, even when he was challenging her to think harder, do better. They met years ago at a healthcare justice conference in Chicago. She was presenting on trauma-informed emergency care. He was on a panel about racial bias in maternal health. They disagreed on stage but ended the night sharing fries at a hotel bar, talking until sunrise. He once told her, "You don't have to raise your voice to be powerful. You just have to know where to aim your silence." That silence was heavy now, sitting between her and the woman who had made it clear she wasn't welcome here. A man in the row ahead lifted his hand. "Excuse me," he called out. "Could I get a sparkling water, please?" Claudette appeared almost instantly. Her voice turned silkier, her stride graceful. She leaned in, smiling with a practiced warmth. "Of course, Mr. Duncan. Lemon or lime?" "Lime, please." "Coming right up." Then she turned and caught Amara's gaze, expression back to stone. Amara hesitated, then reached toward the small call button and pressed it. Claudette walked over slower this time, eyes fixed straight ahead until the very last step. She didn't speak, just waited. "My seatbelt's stuck," Amara said quietly. "Would you mind?" Claudette exhaled, a short, sharp breath through the nose. "You don't need assistance, ma'am," she said, folding her arms. "You just need to try harder." A pause. Amara blinked, not in confusion, but in calculation. She nodded once. "Understood." Claudette didn't respond. She simply walked away, her heels clicking in crisp rhythm against the aisle floor. Amara could feel it then. Those subtle stares. The woman diagonally across from her was watching over the edge of her book. A man 2 rows back whispered something to his wife, and the two exchanged glances. Her cheeks burned, not with shame, but with that particular heat that comes when you're reminded the rules don't apply the same to you. Not when you're a black woman, 7 months pregnant, asking for something you're already entitled to. She leaned her head back against the headrest, exhaled through her nose, and reached for her phone again. This time she didn't open her text. She opened a different app, one few passengers would recognize. The screen loaded with a simple, dark interface. At the top, Aurelia Sky's shareholders board. A notification glowed. "You have 3 pending votes to review: emergency protocols and staff conduct policies." Amara didn't tap it, not yet. She stared at the screen for a moment, then locked the phone again. There was a time she would have acted right away, spoken up, demanded a supervisor, reminded Claudette of policy and courtesy, but she wasn't here to make noise. Not this time. This time she was waiting for something bigger. Claudette passed her again, whistling softly as if to herself. The tune wasn't pleasant. It was pointed, passive. A woman sitting behind Amara leaned forward slightly and whispered to her companion, What's she doing up here? Thought this section was more curated. Amara heard it. She heard all of it, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she opened her phone again and typed a message. Seat 2A, ready when you are. She hit send. Somewhere on the ground, a notification lit up. As the engines hummed and the captain announced their pushback from the gate, Amara stared straight ahead. The plane was about to move, but so was something else. The lights dimmed to a soft amber glow as the cabin doors sealed shut with a low hiss. A gentle chime rang overhead, followed by the captain's voice, calm and practiced, announcing final preparations before takeoff. In the hush that followed, people adjusted their blankets, scrolled through screens, or closed their eyes to steal a few minutes of rest before the ascent. Amara leaned forward, carefully pulling the seatbelt across her belly. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the strain of maneuvering around the tight space while carrying so much weight, literal and otherwise. The latch wouldn't click. She tried again, shifting in the seat, jaw clenched against the ache that shot through her side. A young flight attendant passed by. She noticed the struggle and hesitated, a flicker of concern on her face. She was barely out of training, Amara guessed, based on the nervous energy in her step. Would you like me to? I'll handle it, Claudette cut in, her voice sharp as a knife slicing through the quiet. The younger attendant paused, nodded quickly, and disappeared down the aisle. Claudette approached like a storm front. Tight movements, lips pressed flat, eyes cold. She didn't crouch or soften her tone. This is basic, ma'am. I can't believe you travel alone in this condition. Maybe next time, try economy. Amara exhaled slowly, working to keep her voice level. I have a valid first-class ticket. I just need help, not judgment. Claudette leaned in, voice low enough that only nearby passengers could catch it. Help is for those who help themselves. Before Amara could respond, Claudette reached down without warning and shoved the seatbelt buckle into place. Hard. Her palm hit Amara's shoulder with an audible smack as she adjusted her posture, like someone handling a misaligned doll. The impact jolted through Amara's body. Her breath caught. Someone gasped. A man in 2C muttered, Jesus, and looked away. Claudette stood upright, brushing her hands like she'd just fixed something unpleasant. No apology, no acknowledgement. Just a look that said, problem solved. Amara didn't say a word. She didn't have to. She shifted slightly in her seat, her palm gliding instinctively over her belly. She wasn't protecting herself anymore. She was protecting someone else now. And somehow that gave her a strength that anger never had. Her eyes lifted slowly to meet Claudette's. There was no fury in them, just disappointment. Not the kind that shouted, but the kind that lingered. Claudette turned on her heel and walked off, as if nothing had happened. A few rows back, an older woman leaned toward her husband and whispered, "That didn't look professional." Amira reached for her phone again. Her hands no longer trembled. She unlocked it, opened a secure messaging app, and typed just 5 words. Seat 2A, physical contact initiated. Proceed. She hit send. No sound, no flash. Just a message dispatched quietly into the system she helped build. The system she'd trusted would work when the time came. The phone went back into her tote. Her eyes closed. Her breath slowed. She wasn't planning revenge. She wasn't fueled by rage. She was thinking 5 steps ahead, and she knew exactly what she was doing. The thing about power, she'd once told Tay, is that it's not about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about knowing when silence will say more. A few minutes passed. Claudette passed by again, her eyes avoiding Amara's completely. No words this time, no looks. Just the sound of her shoes tapping a rhythm that no longer felt so sure of itself. Amira noticed the way another flight attendant, a tall man in his 40s, glanced her way. It was quick, but something in his eyes flickered. Uncertainty, maybe even regret. The engines hummed louder as the plane began its slow taxi toward the runway. Outside, night had settled over Atlanta like a heavy curtain. Inside, first class had grown unusually still. Nobody knew what was coming, but Amara did. The plane rolled gently forward on the tarmac, a low rumble beneath the cabin floor like a giant steady breath. To most passengers, it was just another evening flight. But to a select few, those who knew what to watch for, It was something entirely different. Near the front of the business class section, a man in his early 50s sat quietly, his demeanor more composed than the average traveler. His dark blazer bore a subtle pin with the Aurelia Skies crest, though most wouldn't notice. The screen in front of him showed the cabin layout, camera angles piped directly from the overhead security system, an internal tool few even knew existed. He sipped water and listened through a discreet earpiece. Suspected breach of code of conduct, a calm voice said. Confirm physical contact. Authorization to pause flight? He didn't respond out loud. He simply reached down and pressed a small button labeled yes. Back in first class, Amara sat still, hands resting lightly over her belly. The warmth of her skin met the coolness of the seatbelt buckle. She could still feel the weight of that moment, the sharp, dismissive contact, not a blow hard enough to bruise, but hard enough to make a point, that she didn't belong, that she should have known better than to ask for help. She wasn't hurt, not physically, but her spirit had taken a hit. She stared straight ahead, her thoughts moving faster than the taxiing plane. She'd seen this play out before, in hospitals, in courtrooms, in staff lounges. Moments when people like her were treated like intruders in spaces they'd earned the right to be in. And the consequences always fell on them, not on the ones who made them feel small. She thought of the child she was carrying, the world he or she would enter. Would they be protected? Would they learn to speak softly and still be heard? If I lose my temper, I'm unstable, she thought. If I stay calm, I'm weak. The echo of Tay's voice floated through her memory. Some battles are won with silence, not because we're afraid to speak, but because we're choosing when to be heard. Her breath slowed. She looked at the people around her. Most were pretending to scroll their phones, their eyes flicking toward her and then away again. No one spoke up. Not really. A few whispers here and there, but no one had intervened. Still, that didn't surprise her. She'd stopped expecting justice to arrive on its own. She was justice now. Quiet, watchful, ready. From the back of the cabin, a male flight attendant approached Claudette, who had returned to her usual pacing routine. The captain would like a word with you in the galley, he said in a low tone. Claudette narrowed her eyes. Now, he nodded. She didn't protest, but her spine stiffened as she turned and walked toward the rear of the first-class section, disappearing behind the partition. Moments later, another flight attendant, a woman Amara hadn't noticed before, stopped by her seat. She didn't say a word. She simply placed a cold towel and a glass of water on the tray table, then offered Amara a quiet glance. Not pity, not curiosity, just acknowledgement, a kind of apology. Amara gave the faintest nod in return. Then the captain's voice filled the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, due to an unexpected operational issue, we will be returning to the gate. Please remain seated as we follow standard protocol. The murmurs started immediately. A man 2 rows back leaned over to his neighbor. Is this about the woman? Another replied, something must have happened. You think she's suing? Claudette reappeared a few minutes later. Her face had changed, still composed but tense. Her stride lacked its earlier precision. She walked past Amara without so much as a glance. Amara didn't react. She leaned her head back, closed her eyes, and let her hands settle again over her belly. She felt the small thump inside, her baby shifting slightly. They were both waiting now. The plane slowed to a stop. In a monitoring room hundreds of miles away, a digital log updated itself automatically. Security camera feeds rolled silently, time-stamped and indexed. A green box highlighted Amara's seat. Another window popped up on the screen, flashing a message. Subject, Dr. Amara Ellison, verified Tier 1, shareholder wife of Mr. Tay Ellison. Immediate action required. What no one else on board knew, at least not yet, was that this wasn't just another flight delay. This was the moment everything began to shift. The plane sat idle at the gate, engines quiet now, the hum of anticipation replaced by a thick, pressing silence. No one moved. The seatbelt signs remained lit, but it wasn't about safety anymore. It was about control, and the slow unraveling of it. Claudette paced the aisle near the galley, her usual precision gone. Her shoulders were tighter, jaw clenched just enough to show. Every so often, she glanced back toward Amara, as if trying to make sense of the delay. Finally, she leaned toward a junior flight attendant. What the hell is going on? This can't be about that woman. The attendant shrugged. They told us nothing. Orders from the top. Claudette's lips tightened. She looked like someone realizing the ground beneath her wasn't as solid as she thought. Amira remained in her seat, her posture still and composed. She rested one hand on her belly, the other on the armrest. Her eyes didn't scan the room, didn't follow the whispers. She knew what was happening. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about letting the truth arrive in its own time. She thought back to the boardroom in New York, not even 2 months earlier. The vote had been tense, a room of suits and scripted language debating what she saw every day on the ground. She had spoken up clearly then about the need for empathy training, about the danger of unchecked authority, about what happens when people like her get dismissed in first class, in hospitals and classrooms. They'll only understand when it's personal, she had said. Now it was. No more hypotheticals, no more delays. A rustle broke the tension as a man in a sharp navy suit stepped onto the plane, clipboard in hand, badge clipped to his chest. Director, Internal Affairs. He moved down the aisle with quiet purpose, stopping in front of seat 2A. I need to speak with Dr. O'Mara Ellison, he said, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. On behalf of Aurelia Skies, we apologize for what has occurred. You have full authority to proceed as you see fit. There was a ripple through the rows. Heads turned. A few passengers stiffened in their seats. One woman dropped her phone. Claudette stopped mid-step, her body frozen. The man bowed his head slightly toward Amara. Your husband has been informed. The board is on standby. Please let us know if you wish to file your report now or after landing. Amara didn't rush to answer. She simply nodded, then turned her gaze toward the window. She didn't need to say yes. Her presence had done enough. Across the aisle, a man who had earlier given her a condescending look now avoided her eyes entirely. Another woman, who had clutched her purse tighter when Amara walked in, fidgeted with her ring, eyes downcast. Claudette swallowed. I was just doing my job, she said quietly. I didn't know. Amara turned her head slowly. Her voice was soft but firm, like velvet stretched over steel. Exactly, she said. You didn't know, and that's the problem. The silence that followed was different than the one before. It wasn't awkward. It was heavy, full, like the truth had finally taken a seat among them. Claudette was escorted off the plane. No resistance, no more glances. She walked like someone who wasn't sure how she had ended up on the wrong side of her own story. A member of the crew approached Amara gently. Ma'am, we've prepared a seat for you in the rear lounge cabin if you'd like some privacy. She shook her head. No, thank you. I'll stay here. Her voice was steady, unshaken. There was no defiance, only clarity. She had earned her place, and she wasn't going to disappear just because the storm had passed. Passengers shifted in their seats, some clearly unsure what to do next. A few nodded at her. Some stared. Most said nothing. But the atmosphere had changed, like the air pressure had adjusted, even before takeoff. As the cabin settled again, Amira folded her hands over her belly and leaned back. Not in retreat, but in presence. She had waited long enough, and now things were finally beginning to move. The cabin lights stayed dim, but the mood had shifted entirely. The flight no longer felt like a delayed journey. It felt like a courtroom in the sky. No one spoke. No one adjusted their seats or checked their phones. Even the children seated farther back were quiet, sensing that something serious was unfolding. 2 men and a woman entered the first-class cabin from the front, each dressed in tailored suits with Aurelia Skies ID badges pinned neatly to their lapels. One was a senior director in passenger relations. The other 2 were representatives from the Shareholder Oversight Committee. Their presence made it clear this wasn't about a customer complaint anymore. This was corporate accountability, and it was happening now. The lead director stepped forward. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, voice calm but firm, we apologize for the delay. Due to a serious internal incident involving staff conduct, we are addressing the matter immediately and transparently. He didn't look at Amara when he said it. He looked at everyone. The cabin was still. They invited Claudette back into the front of the plane, not to resume her duties, but to face the moment. She walked slowly now, no longer the polished professional who'd moved like clockwork. She took a seat across from Amara at the front row of the cabin. Her posture was stiff, but not from pride, from fear. "I didn't know who you were," Claudette said, her voice quieter than before. "I thought you were just some woman causing delays." Amara didn't blink. "You thought I didn't belong here. Because of how I look. Because I asked for help. Because I didn't yell back." Claudette opened her mouth, scrambling for an out. "It wasn't personal. But it always is," Amara cut in, her voice unwavering. "For people like me, it's always personal." A silence followed that line, the kind that didn't feel awkward. It felt heavy. A couple of rows back, an older gentleman slowly lowered his head. You could feel the shift, like a collective weight people hadn't known they were carrying had been pulled into the open. Amara didn't look around. Her focus remained on Claudette, but she wasn't trying to shame her. That wasn't the point. She reached for her phone and opened the secure portal linked to her shareholder rights. Her thumb hovered for only a second before tapping. Initiate emergency vote. Staff conduct and passenger protection policy revision. She looked up at the Internal Affairs Director. "I want immediate suspension of the staff involved," she said clearly. "I request mandatory anti-bias training for all frontline personnel. And I want this flight recorded as a precedent." The director nodded once. "It will be done. Effective immediately." Claudette stood up. She looked down at her hands, then around the cabin. Not with defiance this time, but confusion, disbelief. Her voice cracked. "This is my career," she whispered. "My whole life. I've worked 20 years. Amara didn't raise her voice. She didn't show anger. Her words came slow, even, almost gentle. "Then you should have learned by now that kindness isn't optional, especially at 30,000 feet." No one said anything after that. There was nothing left to say. Claudette was escorted off the plane. A few passengers followed her with their eyes, but the earlier sympathy was gone. This wasn't about a bad day or a misunderstanding. It was about a pattern, a system, and someone finally saying, "Enough." A flight supervisor approached Amara a few minutes later. "We've prepared a seat in the business class lounge if you'd like more comfort," she offered kindly. Amara shook her head. "I'll stay here," she replied. The supervisor didn't argue. She just gave a small nod and stepped back. The announcement came over the speaker shortly after. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared to taxi once again. Thank you for your patience." Amara leaned back in her seat, hands resting on her stomach, feeling the faint movement of the life inside her. The cabin felt different now, not lighter, but honest, like something had been stripped away, and the truth had finally taken its place. The director leaned in before stepping off the plane. "The board has voted in your favor," he said quietly. "The changes begin today." As the plane eased away from the gate once more, Amara closed her eyes and smiled. Not out of victory, but because the weight was no longer hers to carry alone. The private section at the back of the plane had gone silent. No hum of idle conversation, no clinking of glasses, just the low buzz of overhead lighting and the faint pressure of something unresolved hanging in the air. A flight manager stepped in quietly. "She asked to speak with you before she leaves," he said. Amara didn't flinch. "That's fine." A few minutes later, Claudette entered the small lounge-like space, shoulders hunched but chin still lifted, like she hadn't quite decided whether to stand tall or finally lower her guard. Her eyes scanned the room before they settled on Amara, who sat calm and upright, both hands gently cradling her stomach. There was no performance, no pretense of authority, no sharpness in Claudette's voice. "I wasn't always like this," she began, her voice a shade above a whisper. "I used to love this job. I used to care." Amara said nothing. She didn't rush her. She simply listened. Claudette stepped closer, her eyes not quite able to hold contact for more than a second. But they kept promoting the young, the new, the diverse, she said, the last word landing heavier than the others. "I became invisible, and I started believing maybe I had to be cold to be seen." There was no venom in her tone, just weariness, like someone admitting the lie they'd told themselves for too long. Amara finally spoke. "So you made others invisible to feel seen," she said softly. "That's not survival, that's surrender." Claudette blinked quickly, but one tear slipped through. I thought if I kept my head down, if I stayed perfect, maybe I could outlast the changes. But the more I tried to protect myself, the less I recognized who I'd become. She wiped her cheek with the back of her hand and let out a shallow breath, trembling slightly. There was no anger now, only unraveling. Amara rose slowly, steadying herself with one hand on the table, the other still resting on her belly. I'm not angry at you, she said, looking Claudette directly in the eye. I'm disappointed that after 20 years in the sky, you forgot how to look people in the eye. It wasn't meant to cut, but it did. Claudette lowered her head. No apology followed, just silence. That was enough. A few minutes later, Amara returned to her seat in first class. The hush in the cabin lingered, but it wasn't hostile. It felt more like reverence, like everyone knew they had witnessed something they couldn't unsee. She waved gently to the flight manager and asked to speak with someone from public relations. A call was made immediately. When the line connected, she didn't waste time. I want the apology to go public, she said, not for my sake, but because this is a chance to teach, not to punish, but to reform. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a firm, understood. The draft of the official statement began circulating minutes later. Aurelia Skies Airlines issues public apology following incident of misconduct. New policies protecting vulnerable passengers to be implemented fleet-wide. No spin, no excuses, just accountability. Soon after, Claudette exited the aircraft quietly with an escort. No applause followed her, no glares either. Just a silence that said her chapter had closed and something else had begun. Back in her seat, Amara accepted a small porcelain cup from a young flight attendant with a soft smile. Would you like sugar or honey, Doctor Ellison? Amara looked up, warmth flickering in her tired eyes. Just honey, she said gently. That's enough. The cup felt warm in her hands, not because of the tea, but because it had been offered without hesitation, without judgment. That, in itself, was something. Outside the window, dawn was beginning to stretch across the horizon. The clouds below caught the first blush of morning light, soft pinks melting into gold. Amira watched it unfold, her reflection faint in the glass. This wasn't about winning. This was about planting something that might outlive her, a precedent, a protection, a shift. She leaned back, closed her eyes, and whispered under her breath, more to herself than anyone else. Maybe the skies can be fairer. Maybe this time, change will stick. The little cafe on the corner of 73rd and West End smelled of cinnamon and early spring. Outside the window, Central Park was coming back to life. Bare trees turning to blush, toddlers wobbling on scooters. Inside, Amara sat at a window seat, her belly now heavier, fuller, her posture relaxed. In her hands was a folded copy of the Atlantic Press. The headline read, Aurelia Skies overhauls passenger care policies. After incident on Flight A714, company to launch mandatory empathy training for all frontline staff. Below the headline was a photo of a cabin, first class, wide angle, empty, but alive with the implication of something having happened there. There was no face in the image, no names in the main story, but in smaller font, at the end of the editorial, it said, thanks to a woman who chose grace over rage. Amara traced the edge of her teacup, watching steam curl and disappear. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. Tay, she answered with a smile already forming. The vote passed, he said, his voice soft and full of relief. All 10 board members approved. It's official. You made it happen, Amara. She looked out at a young mother pushing a stroller along the park path, her child bundled and giggling. No, Amara said gently. We made it happen. All the silent ones who needed to be heard. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause filled with understanding. They didn't need to say much more. The work had begun. Later that day, an email was sent out to every passenger, employee, and partner of Aurelia Skies Airlines. Simple and clean. No corporate jargon, no evasion. To all who fly with us, we failed to see, we failed to listen, but we are learning, and we will do better. Not because we have to, but because it's the right thing to do. It was signed by the acting CEO. And just below his name, a final line in bold, with gratitude to Dr. Amara Ellison, who reminded us that dignity must always be the first service we offer. The story made it to national news. Morning anchors spoke not just about what happened, but what was changing. In a rare move, Aurelia Skies has implemented immediate reforms, setting a precedent for the industry, one report read. At Skyport Terminal, a local channel interviewed a group of college students returning from spring break. One of them, a young black woman with a travel pillow around her neck, smiled and said, "I used to avoid flying first class. Not anymore." By the end of the week, 3 other airlines had announced internal reviews. One even launched a task force to address service disparities. And Amara? She found herself back at Skyport, not as a passenger this time, but as a keynote guest. The training auditorium had been transformed. Staff lined the aisles from new hires to veterans. A large banner hung overhead. "Every seat deserves dignity." She didn't speak long. She didn't need to. Her presence said more than any slide deck could. At the end of the session, an older flight attendant approached her quietly. "I used to work with Claudette," she said. "She's not here today, but she left something for you." She handed over a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. "Thank you. I forgot how to see. You reminded me." Amara folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her purse. She didn't know what Claudette's future looked like, but maybe, just maybe, there was space for growth. After the event, she walked down to the gate. No flight to catch, just a view she had come to appreciate more than ever. She stood by the window, looking out at the runways stretching wide beneath an open sky. The clouds were high and soft, brushed by early sunlight. Planes lifted into the air like possibilities. She whispered under her breath, to no one in particular, but maybe to the women who came before her and the daughters who would come after. This time we didn't just fly, we rose. Sometimes the loudest power in a room comes from the one who says the least, until the moment truly matters. Amara didn't need to shout to be heard. She needed to wait, to act with purpose, and remind an entire system what respect should look like at 30,000 feet. What about you? Have you ever witnessed quiet strength change the course of something bigger? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more true-to-life stories that reveal the power of dignity, one voice at a time.